Let's imagine together that we are in a small town called Villisca, located in the heart of Iowa, United States in 1912. A peaceful town where everyone knows each other, where children play in the streets and afternoons are spent talking on the porches. But one house there, an apparently ordinary house on 2nd Street, hides a dark secret that continues to haunt the town's memory to this day. The Villisca house, with its simple but sturdy structure, was the home of a simple family, full of love. Josiah and Sarah Moore, a devoted couple, and their 4 children, lived there in peace. On a warm June night, the house became the scene of a crime that still resonates in the corridors of time. What happened that night goes far beyond rational explanation. And as the story unfolds, you will realize that something else, something invisible and evil, hides in the shadows of the house. Something that will leave the town in shock and generate a wave of mystery no one could have predicted. The story begins on a summer night, June 9th, 1912, when the Villisca house was hosting the Moore family. Josiah and Sarah, the couple aged 43 and 39 respectively, and their 4 children. With them were 2 invited children, sisters Ina and Lena Stillinger, who were spending the night at the house. The house was modest but full of life and laughter. They were preparing for a quiet night. Sarah and Josiah had returned from the local church that evening, as usual, and had gathered with the children to sleep. The children's room was simply decorated, with iron beds and white curtains gently fluttering in the cool night breeze. Nothing unusual seemed to be in the air, but there was a nearly imperceptible feeling that something was wrong. As the children slept, unaware of what was to come, an intruder approached the house. But this was not just any murderer. He carried something else with him. Perhaps a demonic presence or a tortured spirit that had inhabited the place, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The night advanced and the tranquility was broken by the sound of something moving silently, almost as if something were watching closely. As the night went on, the murderer entered the Villisca house. He used an axe, a seemingly harmless tool, but one that would become the cause of one of the most brutal and incomprehensible murders in U.S. history. The murderer made no noise. He didn't draw attention. He entered quietly, perhaps with some familiarity with the location, as if he already knew where to go. Instead of attacking in plain sight, he attacked where no one could see, in the beds where the children and parents slept, completely defenseless. The murderer began with Josiah Moore hitting him on the head with a fatal blow. Next, it was Sarah's turn, who was also attacked while sleeping with no chance to defend herself. The children, all vulnerable, were hit in sequence. Ina and Lena, the 2 visiting girls, slept beside the Moore children and were also brutally murdered. Each blow was delivered with cruel precision. The bodies were left scattered throughout the rooms, but the murder was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much more disturbing. The house was filled with blood, but it wasn't just the blood that left a trail. There was something else, something that made anyone who entered feel a presence that wasn't human. The murderer disappeared without leaving a trace, but the house was forever marked. When the police investigated the crime scene, they were completely perplexed. There were no signs of forced entry. The windows were closed, the doors locked. How did the murderer enter the house without being noticed? How did he carry out the massacre without leaving any clues? The answer, however, was even more disturbing. As the investigation unfolded, unsettling reports began to emerge from local residents who claimed to have seen something strange. Some swore that the windows of the Villisca house were moving on their own, and that mysterious shadows passed through the house's walls, especially at night. But that wasn't all. Those who entered the house to investigate claimed that something was present there. Reports from investigators and even police officers who were at the crime scene indicated a heavy atmosphere and a sense of being watched. Some claimed to have heard a peculiar sound, like distant whispers coming from the walls of the house, and nightmares began to take over those who dared stay in the house longer. Many claimed that while they slept, they saw the faces of the victims in the corners of the rooms or felt a pressure on their chest, as if an invisible presence were trying to suffocate them. It was as if the victims' souls were trapped in the house, unable to rest. But the scariest thing of all was that every night something new would happen. The lights would flicker strangely and objects would move without explanation. An overwhelming pressure in the air made anyone who entered feel tense and uncomfortable. It was no longer just a crime scene, but a place of continuous torment. As months went by, the phenomena intensified. It was no longer just shadows in the windows or whispers in the distance. The presence in the Villisca house was becoming bolder, more visible, more palpable. People who passed by the house at night claimed to see figures in the windows. When they approached the door, they heard faint, mocking laughter. Sometimes when they tried to enter, they felt an invisible force holding them back, as if something were trying to keep them away. On specific nights, the sound of dragging footsteps down the hallway could be heard, but when they looked, no one was there. A feeling of suffocation hung in the air, and those brave enough to spend a night in the house began to have terrifying nightmares. Some saw ghostly figures of the victims. Others heard the cries of children begging for help, as if they were still trapped in the house. No one knew exactly what was happening there. Was it the spirit of the victims, or the spirit of the murderer himself, or something even more evil? The fact was that the Villisca house was alive with the terror of the past. To this day, the Villisca house remains one of the most haunted places in America. Ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and curious people have passed through, trying to decipher the mysteries of the house. Each left with a story, a feeling of something that can't be explained. But the truth is that the house has never been vacant. Even after so many decades, there are still those who claim to hear the victims' screams on moonless nights. And it's not just the screams. Some claim that the house still breathes with an evil presence, waiting for its next victim, or perhaps waiting for someone who can finally understand what happened there. And you, would you have the courage to enter that house? The Villisca house remains a cursed place where death and revenge intertwine. The tragedy of June 1912 is not just a story of murder. It is the story of a house that never let its ghosts leave. And as long as the house stands, the echoes of death will continue to haunt those who dare to come near. In one of the oldest and most forgotten parts of New York, there is a narrow street that few know, 50th Street, a place where shadows seem to last longer than the day, and where life seems to follow its own rhythm, isolated from the bustling city around it. In one of those forgotten houses lives a family that, like many others, was simply looking for peace, but what they found was something that defies reason and logic, something invisible, something evil. The house on 50th Street seemed at first glance like a perfect place, a large house with weathered bricks that told stories of decades gone by. However, shortly after moving in, the residents began to notice something peculiar, and that was the beginning of a nightmare from which they would never escape. This is not just another haunted house case. There were no visible ghosts or apparitions, but something much more disturbing and terrifying was present. Something that moved in the shadows, hiding in the cracks of the walls, an invisible presence. It was there, always, as if it were watching every step, every breath of the family. And when this presence manifested, it did so in a way no one could imagine. It all began when the Campbell family, mother, father, and 2 young children, moved into the new house on 50th Street. They were looking for a fresh start, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The house seemed welcoming, with a large garden and classic architecture that evoked a bygone era. But what seemed to be the dream home quickly became the setting for something much darker. From the very first night, strange things began to happen. Low and nearly imperceptible sounds, as if someone were walking through the house, but when the family checked, no one was there. At first, they thought it was just the natural sounds of the house, the wood and windows creaking, the wind in the cracks, but the sound started to intensify. The first to notice something truly strange was the father, Tom Campbell. On a cold autumn night while he tried to sleep, a low sound, almost like a whisper, seemed to come from the wall of his bedroom. He turned, thinking he was hearing the wind, but there was no breeze. The feeling of being watched was so strong that he couldn't sleep for hours. When he told his wife, she tried to reassure him, but that night, it was her turn to notice something. As she prepared to sleep, a strong sense of pressure overtook the room. The air felt heavier, as if something were on top of her, and it wasn't just a feeling. The curtains swayed without wind, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, but there was no one there. Weeks passed, and the family began to get used to the idea that the house had something strange about it. There was no logical explanation for the noises, but no one wanted to believe it was something paranormal. They tried to rationalize it, but every day that passed, what once seemed like coincidence became a terrifying certainty. One particularly silent night, when everyone was in the living room, something inexplicable happened. Sitting on the couch, watching TV, a low and guttural voice was heard. It didn't come from any visible source, but filled the room with an oppressive and threatening presence. It was a distinct voice seeming to originate from the air itself, a muffled whisper, hissing words that made no sense. Tom, who was beginning to worry, stood up to investigate. As he opened the living room door, total silence enveloped the house. There was no one, not even the sound of a footstep. but the feeling of something being present was palpable. A chill ran down his spine and the pressure in the room was almost unbearable. This manifestation was just the beginning of a series of events that would quickly follow. What seemed like an invisible presence turned into something more aggressive. Things started to move on their own. Objects fell from shelves without explanation. Doors slammed violently and the lights flickered for no reason. Then, on a particularly dark night, the voice spoke again. Now the words were clear. The voice no longer whispered incomprehensible murmurs but was communicating directly with the family. Something like, "Leave, or it will be too late." The words were spoken with a malevolent intent, as if something were waiting for the family, something that wanted them gone. But despite the growing fear, the family was still unwilling to leave their home. And that would prove to be a terrible mistake. As the weeks passed, the presence haunting the house was no longer confined to whispers and moving objects. Now, invisible entities seemed to materialize in the room in increasingly disturbing ways. Sometimes, the sound of dragging footsteps echoed through the house as if something were crawling through the hallways. But the worst was yet to come. That night, little Emma, the youngest daughter, began having nightmares. She woke up every night screaming in fear, saying someone was touching her. Her mother, desperate, tried to calm her, but Emma insisted that something was holding her while she slept. And it wasn't just a touch, it was a feeling of suffocation, as if an invisible presence were lying on top of her. One of those nights, while Tom and his wife tried to sleep, they heard Emma's screams coming from her room. When they rushed to her bedroom, they found the girl paralyzed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. There was no one there, but a chilling pressure seemed to have taken over the room, making everyone feel a shiver down their spines. When they tried to get the girl out of the room, the doors wouldn't open. The pressure in the house increased and a feeling of claustrophobia overtook everyone. It was as if the whole house was alive, breathing, and the invisible presence was now dominating the space. With every step they took, the air seemed thicker, heavier. It was one particularly tense night when Tom and his wife realized they could no longer ignore what was happening. The whispered words, the violent manifestations, and the constant sensations of pressure and cold convinced them they were no longer alone. Something was taking over the house. That night, when Tom decided to investigate the source of the sounds, he went down to the house's basement, where the feeling of unease seemed strongest. The stairs creaked with each step, and a sense of imminent danger enveloped him. As he descended into the basement, he heard a familiar whisper coming from the depths of the darkness. When he approached, he saw something he could never have imagined, a shadowy figure, an invisible presence forming in the air before him. The figure had no defined shape, but it moved as if it were dense fog. It wasn't human, it wasn't something Tom could comprehend, but the feeling of hatred and vengeance emanating from that presence was undeniable. It was something that didn't just want to scare, but to consume. Tom, overcome by fear, ran back to the living room and found his wife and children in panic. They could no longer take it, and they were ready to leave the house. But before they could, the entity's voice sounded again, this time clear and threatening. "You can't leave. Now it's too late." The family finally managed to leave the house. But to this day, the house on 50th Street still stands, a reminder of something that cannot be explained. No one has dared live there again. Some say that if you pass by at night, you can still hear the whispers of the entity that haunts that place, waiting for its next victim. Whoever dares enter that house will never be the same, for the invisible presence of the house on 50th Street has never left. It is lurking, waiting for someone to dare trespass its grounds again. And if you look closely, you might just see the shadows moving behind the curtains, waiting for the next soul to be consumed. In San Pedro, a small town in the countryside where the streets seem forgotten by time, there exists a house that the locals avoid speaking about, known as the House of San Pedro. It is an old structure with imposing architecture, yet it carries an aura of curse. For years, the house stood empty, until one family decided to move in. They were seeking a fresh start, a peaceful life away from the hustle of the big city. However, what they found was something that defied everything they knew about the world, an evil entity waiting to reveal itself. The story of the House of San Pedro is known to few, but those who know its history are never the same again. Reports from neighbors and other families who attempted to live in the house described inexplicable experiences, as if the very air inside the house was saturated with a negative and uncontrollable presence. But no one ever dared investigate what truly happened there until the Costa family decided to move in, and that's when the real terror began. The Costa family, Luis, his wife Clara, and their two young children, Rafael and Sofia, were enchanted by the house as soon as they saw it. The imposing facade with its tall windows seemed like something straight out of a storybook. Despite the neighborhood having a somewhat somber atmosphere and the other houses appearing abandoned, the family was determined to start a new life. They had no idea that this decision would change their lives forever. On the first day, the house seemed perfectly normal. Clara was fascinated by the space and beauty of the house, while Luis felt a strange sense of discomfort that he couldn't explain. However, he didn't want to worry his wife, so he ignored the feeling. As they began to organize their things and explore the house, they began to notice something peculiar, a strong, musty odor coming from somewhere upstairs. No matter how much they cleaned, the smell persisted as if it were embedded in the walls. Rafael, the older son, began to complain of severe headaches whenever he was on the second floor. Clara, though reluctant, also began to feel a pressure on her chest as if the air was denser inside the house. But, as in many of these stories, people try to rationalize the strange occurrences, and the family moved on, unaware that the evil entity was only beginning to make its presence known. As the days went by, even stranger things started happening. At night, Clara heard low, incomprehensible whispers coming from the walls. She tried to ignore them, believing they were just the sounds of the old house. But soon the voices began to grow clearer and more frequent. She tried to talk to Luis about what she was hearing, but he simply didn't believe her. To him, they were just the natural sounds of an old house. But one night, while he was working late in the living room, he also heard the whispers. They were distorted words, as if someone were speaking directly into his ear, but when he turned around, no one was there. The feeling of being watched was constant, as if a presence was always lingering around the house. Luis began to feel a growing sense of nervousness and anxiety, yet he still tried to justify it all as the strain of moving into an old house. However, something was changing. The atmosphere in the house had become heavy and oppressive, and soon, things started happening that couldn't be explained. Objects began to fall for no apparent reason. One night, the family portrait hanging on the wall moved on its own, crashing to the floor with a loud thud. When Clara and Luis rushed to see what had happened, the portrait was facing the wall, as if someone had deliberately placed it that way. Rafael, the eldest son, also began having terrible nightmares, screaming during the night and saying that someone was in his room, even though the door was always locked. He reported seeing a dark shadow moving across the room, but whenever he looked, the shadow would vanish. The situation began to spiral out of control. The Costa family felt hunted, as if they were constantly being watched. The feeling of being trapped inside the house grew stronger. One night, during a storm, the strong winds battered the windows, and in the distance Clara heard something terrifying, a low, mocking laugh coming from upstairs. She rushed to the children's room, but when she entered, everything was silent. The children were asleep, but Clara could feel that something was wrong. On an especially harrowing night, the silence was shattered by a piercing scream from the second floor. Luis ran to see what was happening and found Rafael in a state of shock, pointing at the window. When Luis looked, he saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Something was there, but it couldn't be seen. The pressure in the air was oppressive, and with each passing day, the presence in the house became more aggressive. Strange whispers began to echo throughout the entire house, and no one could sleep without being consumed by a growing fear. Clara and Luis were beginning to doubt their own sanity. The presence no longer seemed merely invisible. It now felt like it had a body, a way of acting, an intention. One night, the doors of the house began slamming violently. The sound seemed to come from within, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with the family. When Luis and Clara finally managed to open one of the locked doors, they found the children's room in complete chaos. Everything was thrown to the floor as if an invisible force had taken physical form and lost control. It was then that Rafael, trembling with fear, revealed something even more disturbing. He claimed he had seen a shadowy figure in his window, something faceless, yet steadily approaching him, feeding on his fear. "He wants to take me, Dad. He wants to take me," Rafael sobbed, his voice breaking with terror. The boy seemed utterly consumed by dread. The house was no longer a home. It had become a prison, and the entity was now revealing itself in violent and increasingly dangerous ways. It was at that moment that the true nature of the presence became clear. It wasn't a mere vengeful spirit, but a malevolent entity, a demon seeking souls to consume. The San Pedro house had been built on a site where a summoning ritual had been performed years earlier, a place consecrated to a dark power. The Costa family, after weeks of terror and suffering, finally managed to escape the house. However, what they left behind was a scar of fear and destruction. construction. Even after they abandoned the place, neighbors reported hearing the sounds of footsteps, laughter, and whispers coming from within the house, yet no one dared to enter again. Today, the San Pedro house remains empty, with its rusted gates and broken windows. Those who pass by claim that, on stormy nights, a voice can be heard whispering in the wind, as if the entity is still waiting, watching. No one dares to live there anymore, and the house has become a symbol of an evil that never fades. This house, located in Hillview, is one of those places where the shadows stretch far beyond what we can see or understand. Built in the late 19th century, the house had an imposing facade and was considered one of the most beautiful in the region. However, shortly after its construction, disturbing reports of paranormal activity and inexplicable behaviors began to surface, leading the house to be known for something far more sinister: the place where the living and the dead met. For over 100 years, Hillview has been the scene of supernatural phenomena that shook the community and attracted the attention of paranormal investigators, journalists, and curious people. And the most frightening part of all, there is no single account of who in fact started haunting the house. The first signs of something supernatural began shortly after the new owners moved into the house. Reports of footsteps upstairs, even when no one was there, started circulating among the neighbors. The homeowner, a woman named Alice Bennett, began hearing strange sounds, muffled laughter, and ominous knocks on the walls. But what truly alarmed her was the constant sensation of being watched, as if something was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Over time, things worsened. The house became plagued by inexplicable noises, shattering glass, strong winds emanating from within the walls, and even furniture moving on its own. When Alice tried to call in a specialist to investigate, the investigator, Dr. Harold James, uncovered something even more unsettling. He reported feeling a pressure on his chest, a suffocating sensation that made it difficult to breathe normally. He quickly realized that something was feeding on the energy of the inhabitants. It didn't take long before the Bennett family was forced to leave the house due to increasingly violent attacks. Alice was the first to be physically affected by the entity. On several nights, she reported waking up in the middle of the night with invisible hands pressing down on her body, pinning her to the bed and making it impossible for her to breathe. She also experienced a constant sensation of suffocation, as if something was squeezing her chest, not allowing any escape. The most terrifying moment of the story came when Alice claimed to have seen a strange, floating shadow on the stairs of the house by candlelight. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. Alice couldn't move, and the sense of panic was overwhelming. After that, she began losing sleep, feeling constantly watched, until one day she collapsed in the kitchen after an episode of intense vibrations in the wooden floor. When the doctor arrived, he found her in a state of extreme exhaustion and deteriorating health with no clear explanation for the symptoms. What he didn't know was that, from that moment on, the house had begun to take absolute control over those who dared to live there. The case of Hillview House began to gain notoriety, and soon more investigators became interested in the property, especially those dealing with paranormal phenomena. It was paranormal researcher John Winters who decided to conduct a thorough investigation of the house, bringing along his team of experts to try to understand what was happening. John and his team spent several nights in the house, equipped with audio and video recording devices and motion sensors. During one of these nights, they managed to capture screams and whispered words, as if someone was trying to communicate. But what frightened them the most was the moment when a security camera clearly recorded a dark, indistinct figure moving through the house's hallways. However, the most disturbing of all reports occurred during one night of investigation. While they were in the basement of the house, team members felt an oppressive presence and began hearing loud knocks on the walls, as if something were trying to break free from within the earth. At one point, the basement lights began flickering uncontrollably, and a guttural, high-pitched sound echoed throughout the area, sending everyone into a state of panic. In the midst of this chaos, investigator Dr. Paul Gibson screamed in terror as he saw a ghostly hand emerging from a wall, but when he approached, the hand disappeared. The story of Hillview House became a legend. No one dared to live there anymore, and the house was eventually abandoned. Local authorities began to investigate further, but soon abandoned the case, claiming that the site was shrouded in a negative energy they couldn't comprehend. However, whenever they passed through the area, many locals reported seeing strange lights in the upper floors of the house and hearing screams coming from within. Years later, a new owner bought the land where the house once stood and built a new building in its place. But reports of inexplicable phenomena began to surface once again. People claimed to hear heavy footsteps at night and, on some occasions, even saw a spectral silhouette near the window of the new structure. Today, The site where Hillview House once stood is still known by many as a cursed and haunted place. Visitors often report uncontrollable feelings of fear, as if something is waiting to strike. And for the bravest, a simple walk through the area at night is enough to make the energy of that cursed house invade their soul and haunt them forever.